Tonight, Joe Biden taking his first steps as president-elect to show how he'll tackle the pandemic. Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris meeting with their newly named COVID advisory board, saying they'll work on getting rapid testing more widely available. But a big focus will be on masks, asking governors to enforce a mask mandate. Biden with this urgent plea to all Americans.
So please, I implore you, wear a mask.
Is the pandemic over?
The pandemic is over. We still have a problem with COVID. We're still doing a lot of work on it. But the pandemic is over. If you notice, no one's wearing masks. Everybody seems to be in pretty good shape.
It's here. You hear what I'm telling you? In my mind, I created it. Don't you? I created it, and it's real. Don't you understand?
Hello everyone, welcome to Struggle Session. I'm your host Leslie Lee III. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a huge show today talking about a very important, very special topic. In fact, call this a very special episode. You remember those from back in the day, those PSAs, the more you know. That's what this episode is today. This episode might be the most important episode of Struggle Session. This might be the most important episode of any podcast that's ever happened. I'm not exaggerating. This podcast could save your life. But before we get into it, off top, gotta thank all our listeners and subscribers. If you're checking us out on Spreaker, on YouTube, on Spotify, or if you're being very generous and subscribing to us on Patreon at patreon.com/struggle session. Or strugglesession.substack.com, or Supercast. You can get all those links at sesh.show. If you've been sending us emails and voicemails at thestrugglesession@gmail.com. And hey, I just celebrated a birthday. Tons of people sent me some wonderful birthday wishes. Thank you all for that. Really appreciate it and your support. The big C, back in the news, back in our minds, our hearts, our stomachs, our other organs. COVID-19, in spite of all of our best efforts to pretend it's no longer a thing, it's still an issue. At the top of the show, I shared some clips over the years from Joseph Robinette Biden, and I think people forget COVID was a defining issue of the 2020 presidential election and was supposed to be very important to his administration. But of course, as you also heard in the clip, on September 19, 2022, Biden declared that COVID was over. And COVID seemed to take that personally. All know Biden was forced to pull out of the presidential race shortly after announcing he was infected with COVID for the second time that we know about. Now, even the president finds himself among millions of Americans who've had their work life affected by ongoing issues with COVID. Biden may have declared that COVID was over, but as he found out, saying something don't make it so. On today's show, we talk with writer and journalist Julia Doubleday about her work, about COVID-19, the ongoing pandemic, and how everyone from the president to pundits to even left-wing media outlets basically pretend it no longer exists. Right now, we are in one of the biggest surges that ever happened. You saw during the Olympics, dozens of athletes infected with COVID. Athletes like Noah Lyles performing with COVID, which is an extremely dangerous thing to do for your long-term health. David Lynch, one of our favorite directors, just revealed in a new interview with Sight and Sound that he was diagnosed with emphysema due to his smoking, and he doesn't regret smoking one bit. He is David Lynch, but he says that if he directs another film, he'll have to do it remotely because he can't risk catching COVID, which is still running rampant in spite of most people attempting to pretend it's not. The worst of it is that places like North Carolina and Los Angeles and New York, this actually has been passed in Nassau County. They're passing bans on masks so that even if people try to protect themselves, they're making them they'll be targeted by police. It doesn't matter if they say there's a medical exemption. That's still a big problem. And this isn't just, a red state issue. As I said, it's also happening in New York and Los Angeles. Hilariously, Karen Bass announced her plans. LA Karen Bass announced her plans to investigate a possible mask ban. And then the next day came down with COVID. So Universe still has a little bit of sense of humor about this, but it's not funny at all, really, unfortunately. But I have a good conversation with Julia. We have a good time. We laugh, we learn, and I really, really hope that you learn something from this because this affects you. That's why this episode is so important. So please, if you haven't been paying attention to the COVID news, you just scroll past it because you think it's over. I mean, it's reasonable to believe that everybody is acting as if it is, but we see these constant signs again. Biden, the Olympics, it's affecting the arts. Rod Stewart, If You Want My Body and You Think I'm Sexy, just got told he's got to stop singing due to COVID. He's far from the only singer, big name singer, dealing with similar issues. So I really hope you enjoy the episode. I really hope you listen to the episode, and please feel free to share it with a friend who might not know that we are actually, yes, still in the pandemic. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoy. Julia, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm a little bit surprised. You reached out to me. You said you wanted to talk to me about something. I was told that this was a problem that had already been dealt with. I was told that COVID was over. The pandemic was donezo.
Yes.
It was out of here, like bell bottoms,
Yeah, I had heard that rumor as well. I'm here to debunk the rumors. You may have heard from President Joe Biden and some of our other elected officials. They may have told you that COVID is mild now, COVID is over now, COVID is nothing you need to worry about. But, as a leftist who likes to bring a critical eye to things that our government says, I want to let folks know that you should not want to sign up for a lifetime of reinfections with this virus, which carries a high risk of disabling illness. There are a lot of medical problems that can arise after a COVID infection. And one thing I think about a lot when people say, I don't know people with long COVID, is that you may not even know what long COVID looks like. You may not know that somebody who's developed a new medical condition may have long COVID or may have post-COVID medical issues, because we're just not being given the information to be able to connect those new health issues to our past COVID infections. So some of the things that can follow a COVID infection include high cholesterol, high blood pressure. It increases your risk of developing diabetes. It increases your risk of heart attack, stroke, blood clots, neurological problems. It can increase your risk of neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's. So there's this huge array of medical conditions that you're going to be at higher risk after you've had COVID. And then we have the population level issue of, okay, this virus causes all of these myriad health issues. And now we're going to give it to everyone every 6 to 12 months. That's a very, very, very large new medical burden for our health system that it frankly cannot handle. But to talk a little bit more about the risk of long COVID specifically. So long COVID is, at this point, they're defining it as a chronic condition that follows COVID. Technically, you need to have had symptoms for more than 3 months following your infection. And there are a few different explanations for why some people don't seem to recover from COVID. One of those explanations is viral persistence. So there were some recent studies that really lent more credibility to this theory, this idea that the body is not fully clearing the the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Another explanation is autoimmunity, that COVID is touching off this process of immune dysregulation that is causing a lot of inflammation and a lot of follow-on health issues. And it also can reactivate viruses in your system. So for example, if you had chickenpox as a kid, you're now going to be higher risk for developing shingles. So the shingles vaccine is something that they typically only prescribe to people over 60, but we're seeing much younger people now developing shingles because of this is just something that the COVID virus can do. In terms of your risk of developing long COVID, studies have found a really wide array of a wide range of percentages of how common this is. And that's because it's been defined kind of unclearly for a long time. But I will say that that range is usually somewhere in the 10 to 20%. It's somewhere in the 10 to 20% range. We do see also a cumulative risk, meaning that the more times you get COVID, the more likely you are to end up with long COVID. So for example, there was a study in Canada recently that found after your first COVID infection, people reported a rate somewhere between 10 and 15% of people reported having long-term symptoms after 3 months. But after the third infection, nearly 40% of people reported having new symptoms that lasted longer than 3 months. So you can see how this is a very unsustainable way to approach this virus, to just continually say, well, just go get it again and hopefully nothing happens. It's just too many reinfections too quickly in too many people. It's very unsustainable.
But a lot of people say, I've gotten COVID a couple of times. It wasn't a big deal. It was just a cold. Some people even catch COVID and they're asymptomatic. Ben Affleck, the last Batman, talked about this. He said, the first couple of times I got COVID, I was asymptomatic. I thought I was just one of those people who just, COVID wasn't going to do anything to me. The third time he got it, he said he suffered, tons and tons of fatigue. And the next thing you know, he's married to J-Lo. So, folks, do not let it happen to you. If it can take down Batman, it could probably take you down.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of dig into this sort of dismissive thought that you're referring to, where people kind of say, well, I don't think COVID is going to hurt me. So there's two things that are wrong with this statement. The first one is, even if it doesn't hurt you, it can still hurt other people. So that was the whole reason that we had masks and lockdowns and all those things back in 2020, was this idea that, well, vulnerable people are more at risk. So I want to protect vulnerable people. As a leftist, I still abide by that, believe in that. But if you go back to 2020, what you may remember is that there were tons of MAGA people who were like, I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not going to lock down. I'm going to do whatever I want. And something they very commonly would say was, well, I got COVID and it was a cold and I'm fine. So we really don't want to be replicating that same thought process of like, I personally was okay, and that means this isn't a problem, because that's just not how viruses or public health works. So that's one issue. The second issue is, as you say, you don't know what is going to happen after your next infection. And right now we are on this pace, this really absurd pace of reinfections where people are getting it every single year. There's no other virus that reinfects at that rate. And there's no other virus that is able to infect so many different parts of your body. So COVID enters your cell through something called the ACE2 receptor. And those are all over your body. And unlike the flu, COVID enters your brain. It can cross the blood-brain barrier. That's a really, really negative, dangerous thing to have a virus continually doing. And there's actually been a few recent studies that have found significant cognitive damage after COVID infections, including after mild infections. So this is something that I want us to think about in the long term. Does it make sense that we want to give people a virus every single year that can cause cognitive damage, even if you're asymptomatic, even if you're mild? The reality is that the acute phase of the virus, that's the phase where you like have a fever or a cough, or it's a few days. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have long-term health problems. And this is something I think that people should understand more generally about viruses. So for example, you might be aware that if you get HPV, that can lead to cervical cancer down the road. That's a virus, but it can later cause other health effects, in the same way that chickenpox can later cause shingles, in the same way that if you get HIV, it's a fever, it lasts for like a week, it's very mild, but then 8 years later, you develop AIDS, your immune system is destroyed. So people need to really sort of recalibrate how they think about viruses, because more than ever, we're really realizing that these infections, they're not just neutral to your body. And just because you recover in the acute phase doesn't mean that you've not incurred damage to your blood vessels, which COVID can do, to your organs, to your heart, to your brain, or that you may not have viral persistence. There's a lot that we're still learning about COVID and long COVID.
Yeah, something that somebody said to me that was just so simple that kind of was like really eye-opening was this. It's like, if you could believe that this virus can kill you, can kill people, why wouldn't it also be able to damage you?
Right.
Like, in some way. Like,
yes, there is a weird binary happening that I would say the media has really sort of pushed this false binary of either you die or you're fine. And that's just not really the way viruses and infections work. There's a lot that can happen between you're fine or you're dead. And we're really seeing the full range of outcomes in, people who have very severe long COVID, milder long COVID, younger people that are having heart attacks and strokes, all these different things that can happen to you after you have an infection. And what's really concerning is that, it would be one thing if COVID were a virus like the measles, where you get it once and then that's it. But COVID isn't like the measles. COVID, you can get it over and over and over again. And unfortunately, it just has this really fast rate of evolution that allows it to reinfect very quickly.
So you mentioned the fast rate that it reinfects and the way it evolves. Something we haven't mentioned that much on the show, I think, so far is the vaccine, which was promised as the thing that was going to get us out of all this. We were all going to be vaccinated, then we were all going to be fine. It was going to stop transmission. It was going to stop us from catching it. And then people started to notice that they kept catching COVID, and people kept spreading COVID. What happened there? And why has there not been any sort of update to the general idea, which I still find people who believe they think that COVID can't hurt them, and because they were vaccinated 2 years ago, 3 years ago, then they're still vaccinated.
Yeah. So a lot of things happened since early 2021. There were hopes, I would say, that perhaps the people who were platformed, who were talking about what was going to happen after the vaccine, perhaps were too optimistic. They were saying, okay, we're going to be able to achieve herd immunity. Now, what herd immunity means is that so many people in society have immunity to this virus, meaning they're not catching it, that it just sort of peters out and it stops being transmitted. And because of this herd immunity, people who are very vulnerable, who don't mount a good immune response, who can't receive the vaccine for medical reasons, young children, all of those people are protected by the herd. That is what is meant by the herd and herd immunity. So that was the goal. And in my reporting, a lot of people now deny that this was the goal of the vaccine rollout, but in my reporting, I review and link to Rochelle Walensky talking to Rachel Maddow saying, we found out that the vaccine stopped transmission, and that means we're going to be able to end the pandemic this way. I want to be clear that this was more of a misinterpretation than a lie. In other words, when these vaccines first came out, when Pfizer first put out their data, they were highly, highly effective even at preventing transmission. The issue is that the virus mutated much faster than we hoped it would. So while they started out super, super effective at stopping transmission, over time they become less and less effective. Now, we do have the boosters. The boosters are formulated for new variants that have evolved, and that's why you should get boosted. But because these variants are evolving so very quickly, we are often 1 or 2 or more variants behind the virus. So when the initial vaccine rollout happened, the vaccine was a good match for the circulating virus. But now, for example, this winter, we all got vaccinated. Well, not all of us. Very few people actually got vaccinated with a new booster. It was formulated for the XBB variant, which was actually predominant a year earlier. So I got vaccinated for the XBB variant this winter, but the dominant variant was JN1, which was a distant relative of XBB. So the problem is that these vaccines cannot keep up with this pace of evolution. Now, the reason that evolution is happening like this is because of the unmitigated spread. There is no attempt to stop this absurd level of spread that's going on all throughout the year. And every time the virus copies itself, every time it reproduces and spreads to more people, it has trillions and trillions of opportunities to mutate, to become more fit, and in this case, more vaccine resistant. So there are two reasons that your vaccines from 2021 are not super effective today. One is that these vaccines actually wane relatively quickly. There is a waning issue with these vaccines. So they are the most effective at 1 to 3 months after you receive the shots. By 4 to 6 months, they have significantly waned. And beyond that, they're just continuing to wane. So I do advise that people get the boosters because it's a downward slope. So when people are saying, oh, I'm totally protected because I got vaccinated like 3 years ago, doesn't make sense with the science we have about these current vaccines. You can see that in the vaccine efficacy data from the CDC. You can see that in the data from the vaccine distributors themselves. Like, this is not controversial. It's not a conspiracy theory. It is in the vaccine efficacy data. They do start to wane in efficacy after several months. That is also true for infection-acquired immunity. So in other words, if you just say, oh, well, I just, get COVID once a year and that's fine, your immunity after that infection also starts to wane really quickly. So this is what makes COVID super dangerous on a population level, is just that nobody is getting that long-term immunity that we really need to suppress transmission and suppress, eliminate the risk for vulnerable people in society. There is no herd immunity to COVID. And if you go back to 2021, I actually wrote a long piece of how the goalposts of success in the pandemic were moved repeatedly. So initially it was, oh, we're going to get herd immunity. Then it became, oh, you know what? Well, we're having breakthrough infections, but they're extraordinarily rare. Now, this is the point at which I would argue that the media is essentially sort of covering for the administration, because the point at which it was clear that the vaccines were being broken by evolution of the virus, they should have started to pressure the administration that we need a different strategy, and we need a vaccine plus strategy, meaning clean air, ventilation, filtration, masks, everything you can think of layered together will help protect the efficacy of the vaccines. That's not what happened. Instead, we get to Omicron. This is the point where Biden got on TV and said, this is just a pandemic of the unvaccinated. You don't need to worry if you're vaccinated. In the next couple months, 200,000 people died, and 40% of them were fully vaccinated. Or I don't remember if I don't think they necessarily had the booster. Some people had boosters, some people didn't, but 40% of them had the original series shots. So these are people who were essentially told, you're not going to die, and then they died. So that's negative, and that's a point at which I think the left really should have started holding Biden's feet to the fire, and instead everyone was just kind of like, those people were old, who cares? So then we get to the following summer. By this point, the majority of people dying are vaccinated. 60% of the people that died in the summer 2022 wave were vaccinated. And along with that, we also had started to hear this rumor of hybrid immunity. Hybrid immunity is a term that was invented for COVID. It was invented to massage our failure to achieve herd immunity. In other words, instead of saying to the public, hey, we thought that we'd be able to have herd immunity just like we have to measles and mumps and diphtheria. You know how every time you leave your house, you don't get exposed to measles, mumps, and diphtheria? That was the goal. That's not what's happening. And their new sort of consolation prize was, oh, you're going to have, quote unquote, rich hybrid immunity. That's when you have a vaccine and you got a COVID infection and now you're immune. Well, guess the fuck what? It's years later and we're going into a summer surge with yet another new variant. I know multiple people who got JN1 less than 6 months ago and who now have gotten one of the new KP variants. This is disastrous. It's just plain disastrous for public health. It's a totally unsustainable burden of infectious disease. And the public just not only doesn't understand this, but they're not even, we have this vaccine only strategy. People aren't even getting vaccinated because they've been so lied to. They've been so told, like, it's a cold now. Why would you go get vaccines every 6 months for a cold? The Biden administration has completely cut the knees out from under its own strategy. Nobody's getting vaccinated. Nobody's doing anything, all because they've repeatedly been told by this administration, by the CDC, and by the media, oh, it's fine, just go get infected an infinite amount of times.
You recently got into a bit of a kerfuffle on Twitter because you called out a specific branch of media that you would think would be talking about this COVID and this
Correct.
failure of the Biden administration. The left media.
The left media, yes.
You very rarely see anything about COVID anymore. You very rarely in the media, if you're looking on social media, and you wrote an article called "Silence from Prominent Left Outlets Continues as Mask Bans Spread."
Yes. So in that article, I focused specifically on a few outlets: Jacobin, The Lever, The Intercept, and Current Affairs. And all four of them have not done enough to talk about what's happening with COVID. They have not talked about clean air. They do not talk about long COVID. I think Jacobin specifically, I saw that they tweeted the words long COVID one time and a joke about how the economy has long COVID, which just tells me you know that long COVID exists, but you refuse to acknowledge it. This is a major...
Which sorry to interrupt you before, especially before you're about to curse someone out, but where you do find a lot of COVID reporting on that note is business
Absolutely.
journals.
I also wrote a piece about this, like Forbes, Bloomberg. There've been strangely a lot of business reporting that touches on long COVID. My own explanation for it is that this is a concern for the economy. This is a long-term concern. You know, what we see are investors, people who are looking at this economic data getting squirrely because so many people are having to leave the workforce. People are getting disabled. People are having to cut hours. And by the way, whenever you hear Joe Biden bragging about his incredible employment data, I want you to keep in mind, if you are not actively job hunting, you do not count as unemployed. So if I've had to leave the workforce or if I've had to cut hours because of long COVID, I do not count as unemployed. So if you're wondering just how those figures are getting so rosy with all these people getting disabled, they're not counted. If you are not able to work, if you're not looking for work, you are not unemployed in that data.
Juking the stats, but please continue cursing them out.
Oh yeah, where was I? I was just saying it's a really fucking big problem. And, Current Affairs is the one that I got into a little bit of a back and forth. It's kind of ironic because out of the four, I do want to be clear, they're actually the best out of the four. They did one really good piece in 2024 about COVID that was like, COVID isn't over. That's great. They still need to do more. The back and forth was really more that they reacted very negatively to and kind of inappropriately to what I was saying about how this is being so ignored on the left. But let me give you an example of how this is harming all of our priorities. So for example, on the Current Affairs page right now, homepage, the top story is about how the NHS is under threat from the Tories. They're trying to privatize it. That's true. And it's a big crisis. And the Tories have been cutting the budget of the NHS for decades. The problem is this article about how the NHS has these insane wait times now does not mention the word COVID. We're 4 years into a pandemic. I recently wrote an article that looks at how every single health system that you look at is now experiencing a crisis. They're experiencing a crisis because there is a huge, unprecedented level of infectious disease spread all the time, all year round. And by the way, that virus also causes heart attacks, strokes, blood clots, diabetes, Alzheimer's. So do that on a population level over and over again. And this is something that you can clearly see in the data. In my article that I put up this week that's sort of calling out these outlets, you can very clearly see where COVID hits. You know, you have a increase in wait times that's happening for years and years and years. 2020 hits, it's like it just goes off a cliff and it never recovers. And denying that that is happening, it is harming our ability to fight for our other priorities. You know, we have teacher shortages, we have student absences, we have healthcare worker shortages. In my piece, I was also talking about how 1 in 4 doctors that have gotten long COVID from work, by the way, cannot work anymore. This is not an industry. These are highly trained professionals. This is not an industry where you just go hire someone new off the street. This is clearly contributing to the shortage. But you have people who are writing about this who are just have blinders on about COVID. They don't want it to be real. They don't want it to exist. They're in denial, and they should not be out front right now talking over disabled people, talking over vulnerable people, ignoring this just completely massive crisis.
Richie Sunak coined this phrase sick note culture because because there's millions of new people disabled in the UK, 2 million with long COVID. But the way he frames it and the way the policy he's crafting is about like, oh, these people are just depressed or sad, or and they just need to get back to work, and we need to push them back to work. And he even wanted to change. I think the plan is actually instead of going to your doctor to determine whether you're too sick to work, he's going to create like a special department for it.
Yes, and this is such a great example of how ignoring COVID is harming all of our priorities, our worker priorities, our healthcare priorities. Basically, now that everyone is sicker and sicker and sicker, instead of there being, a social safety net, more money to disabled people, more money to sick people, you think that's how they're going to handle the population being sicker and sicker? No, they're making people work while they're sick. We see that in the US, where the CDC just recently was like, oh, that 5-day isolation period for COVID, there's too many staff shortages, so never fucking mind, get back to work. And people don't react to this. People on the left just ignore it. The Intercept doesn't say anything. Jacobin doesn't say anything. None of these motherfuckers say anything. And it's just completely beyond belief. My only explanation for it is just that they personally don't want to wear a mask. That's my only explanation for it.
I not to jump down to, because we're on such a good path and we're on such a righteous path so far, but just to be a little bit petty. Just a little bit petty. A lot of these people, they're located in New York, Chicago, LA. For most of the country, the lockdown was not the same as it was in those cities. And our lives are not the same. Yeah. We, in the rest of the country, the flyover states, don't go to a bar 3 or 4 times a week, or a restaurant, or get brunch so often. So the lockdowns for us was a very different thing for people who live that type of urban lifestyle. And I think they do not want to go back to a world where they cannot have fucking brunch. It's sad to say this about people on the left, but I actually do think it's true.
I think it's true. I think there's a few things in there I want to unpack. The first is that, yes, I think there's also just this broader issue of so many people that get platformed. They are not working class people. They are people who were not frontline workers. In my piece, I go over the reality that white people are the least likely to mask and have been since the beginning. The reality that wealthy people are the least likely to mask and have been since the beginning. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is just privilege and feeling like I can do whatever I want to do. Another one is just the fact that these people are more likely to have healthcare. They're more likely to have a primary care physician. They're more likely to be able to get Paxlovid. They're more likely to be able to take paid time off work. And I've actually seen this dynamic happen a few times where a rich white man who's a journalist, who's like a lefty journalist, tweets like, OMG, like, what should I watch on my day off because I have COVID? And then all these people dogpile them like, hey, why don't you fucking talk about COVID anymore? And they just get so offended. And it's because they're just living in their own world where it's like, well, yeah, I'm just going to take 2 weeks off work paid. What, you don't have that? They're not understanding that not everyone can do that. Not everyone can afford to be sick for 10 days twice a fucking year. Not everybody has a fucking nanny. So that's one issue. Not everyone I'm talking about though is rich. Another issue I think is just that people don't understand what long-term adjustment to COVID safety would look like. It doesn't look like everyone has to be in lockdown for the rest of their lives. That's not what is being proposed. It's really, really critical that we get clean indoor air. So the same way that we have clean water so that you don't contract cholera when you drink your water, we have clean food so you don't get some kind of horrible intestinal bacteria when you eat your burger. We need to have indoor air with higher quality ventilation, higher quality filtration. That is going to start to drastically bring down the level of infectious diseases in the air. And we could do it tomorrow. But the fact is, this has been I won't even say it's been poorly communicated. It has not been communicated to the public that there's this like very easy technological way to start to bring down that massive viral load that's in all public spaces, and especially schools, by the way. Schools have atrocious ventilation. And a lot of parents that are concerned about this have started to bring in, there's a little device called an Aeronet that monitors the CO2 in an indoor space. And that tells you it's a proxy measure for how good the ventilation is in there. If you're outside, the CO2 is going to be somewhere between like 350, 450. If you're inside and it's good ventilation, you want it to be as close to that as possible. But if you can keep it under like 600, 700, 800, that's good. If it goes above 1,000 parts per million, at that point, there's so much CO2 in the air that it starts to affect your cognition. It makes you think slower. People are going into their kids' schools and finding that the CO2 concentration in there is over 2,000 parts per million, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. So this is an issue that parents should be pissed about. Everyone should be pissed about. This is something we can do something about tomorrow, and it's not lockdown. And it will also enable us to be more responsive to future pandemics. You know, right now there's a concern that bird flu is in our dairy cows. And you can just imagine how well the US government is handling that. They're not fucking handling it. So if bird flu is to spill over into humans, which is a possibility if they keep letting it spread like this, imagine the difference between we already have clean indoor air everywhere versus we have the nasty recirculated air that's full of diseases. Like, there is a right way to do this, and we're simply not doing it, and people are simply not talking about it. Now, I will say it's still important to wear a high quality mask in an indoor public space. I always do. Now that I'm adjusted to it, I don't find it to be a big deal. I do sometimes dine outdoors. Some people aren't comfortable with that. I personally usually won't do it if there's a surge, but yes, if there's like a patio and I'm away from other people, I'll dine outdoors. But you know, there's a ton of different tools we can use. You can also test before you meet up with people. So I would say the bare minimum is like mask when you're indoors, especially if you're in like a doctor's office, a pharmacy, or on transit, because people have to be in those spaces. You know, disabled people have to travel. They have to get to work. And you know, and that's really true of like, if you're in the grocery store, there's workers that have to be there. So masking in indoor public spaces really helps to bring down that transmission. It's something that you can easily do to protect people in your community, and it will mean that you're getting sick less as well. I mean, that's a big advantage of it. Like,
yes, if you have to do it for your own selfish reasons. I saw this one study about transmission rates on the airplane, mask versus unmasked, and it basically was like, if you're not wearing a mask on a plane, you might as well go and lick the toilet in the bathroom.
No,
because
absolutely.
That's how vast a difference it can make.
Yeah, I'm like disgusted when I get on a plane and I see people not masking at this point. Just knowing what I know, understanding airborne transmission, like, this is nasty. Like, please just cover your nasty mouth. But that being said, you know, I think that not everyone is willing to be absolutely perfect with COVID safety, but I feel like most people, if you understand how damaging this virus is, if you understand that it's killing people, you understand that it's disabling people, I mean, come on, like, be a comrade, you know, like, put the mask on before you go to the supermarket. It's not a big deal. It's not going to hurt you. Kathy Hochul might arrest you, but other than that, like, it should be okay.
Oh, yeah. So before we get off, we've been going a little bit long, but before we get off, we have to talk about these mask bans that started in North Kakalaki, I believe. Yes.
Yes. Correct.
They instituted a ban on mask, a statewide ban on masks with some self-contradictory exemption for medical, but how the final law was formulated, if you're in a private place, anyone there can ask you to unmask for safety reasons, which makes no sense. It's just nonsense.
This is just the latest, you know, the goalposts have been, the Overton window of, you know, anti-mask bullshit has been moving. You know, it went from, oh, masks are a personal choice to now masks are actively harmful, they're causing crime, yada, yada. And I do want to say that everybody who continues to stigmatize masks is partly responsible for this kind of shit happening, because if I'm out in public and I'm the only one that's masked, I'm a lot more likely to get harassed by anti-maskers because I have a target on my back now. I'm the only one, I'm the visibly disabled person in a mask, you know? Whereas if most people are masking, guess what? That mean bully that wants to scream at the one person wearing a mask is not going to just go around trying to harass 90% of people. So like, it does make our lives more difficult as people who are trying to avoid COVID. Oh, sorry, my cat.
Oh, cats are welcome on the podcast.
Yeah. The cat does not like if I pay attention to something that's not her. Anyway. Yeah, I mean, it makes it more difficult for disabled people to get around when you are not doing your part to try to mitigate COVID, but it also makes it more difficult in the sense of like attaching so much stigma to it. And there's also just the cultural and social norms of like, well, no one else is doing it, so I don't want to do it. You know, it makes it a lot harder. So that being said, what happened in North Carolina, yes, they have passed this bill, which is now going to the governor, and it is really, really dangerous. It does contain language about medical exemptions, but anytime that you have any kind of, requirements attached, means testing, that kind of thing, it's ripe for abuse. On the one hand, it's going to discourage people from wearing masks because they're going to be confused about what the rules are. And on the other hand, it's going to encourage those harassers, those people who are trying to snatch masks off people's faces. Even since this bill passed, there was a woman in North Carolina who has cancer. She has like stage 4 cancer. And some guy came up, started screaming at her about how masks are illegal. So this is just a really sick fucking way to target the most vulnerable people during a pandemic when, their lives are hard enough at this point. I mean, my God, can you imagine if you haven't been trying to avoid COVID, which everybody should, but if you haven't, try to think about how stressful the last 4 years are, the things you get invited to, trying to travel, trying to do things and not being able to know that you can protect yourself from a virus that could kill you.
And I just want to take a brief pause because we're talking about vulnerable people. We're talking about disabled people. When it comes to COVID, that's literally every single person. You're one infection away from disability.
Absolutely.
And this is, whenever I tell people this, their eyes get very, very wide. So let's say you're fine now, but you catch COVID, you get long COVID, right? There are no medical treatments. There's no FDA approved treatments. There's some stuff that have worked for some people, but the only thing I say to you is good luck.
Good luck.
Good luck. Yes. Let's say, okay, you do have that good luck. You somehow, after 3 to 24 months of not being too sick to work, perhaps, or just maybe being just sick all the time. All right, let's just say whatever spectrum is on, you miraculously recover for whatever reason. Do you want to know what happens if you catch COVID again?
Absolutely.
Your long COVID comes back, perhaps worse. So this is not something that ends once you get in it. And
Absolutely.
Frankly, we're all in it together now, whether we admit it or not.
Right. And I have 2 thoughts about that. Firstly, yes, I have known people who have gone back to normal and who end up having long COVID after their 3rd, 4th, 5th infection. If you go on any of the long COVID message boards, you will often see people saying, I so regret going back to normal. I so regret doing XYZ. It was not worth this. And I didn't realize I could get it after my 4th infection or my 5th infection or yada, yada. The reality is that your body has been harmed by multiple infections at this point, and it may not be as resilient. It may not be as healthy as it was before your first COVID infection. So,
yeah. Just a brief pause because we haven't said it. Your immune system is not a muscle. You're not trying to exercise
Absolutely.
It by catching as many viruses as possible.
Okay,
Lots of people seem to think that.
Yeah, let me go down this road for a second because this is super, super critical. It's also a really good example of how the mainstream press normalized a bunch of anti-vaxxer bullshit to protect Joe Biden, and it's disgusting. So here's the reality. When masks were first introduced in 2020, some anti-masker, anti-vaxxers were going around saying, oh, we shouldn't wear those. Those are going to hurt our immune system. And the very same outlets that later promoted this fraudulent concept of immunity debt published debunking pieces about how no, masks do not harm your immune system. Not getting sick is not bad for you. This is something that people have just intuitively known for centuries, millennia. Getting sick is bad for you. Not getting sick is not bad for you. The place that this fraudulent theory comes from is something called the hygiene hypothesis, which is itself controversial. But what the hygiene hypothesis says is that when babies play in the dirt, they get exposed to beneficial microbes, and those beneficial microbes can help build the immune system. Beneficial microbes that are in the soil are not the same thing as pathogenic viruses. So let's just have that out there once and for all. It's not good for you to get measles. That's why we vaccinate you. It's not good for you to get diphtheria. That's why we vaccinate you. And like, I can go down the list. We already know what happens when kids are not protected from viruses. It is what has happened for all of human history. Half of them die, okay? So viruses are not good for you. However, after Joe Biden's back to normal vaccine only strategy failed and people started getting sick all the motherfucking time, guess what? The mainstream media decided to adopt as their explanation. The anti-vaxxer bullshit that getting sick is good for you, that masks hurt your immune system, and that now you just need to get extra sick to help build your immune system back up. All of that is false. All of that is anti-science. All of that is a bunch of propaganda designed to get you to accept the fact that your kid is sick as shit. And by the way, the kids are sick as shit. I also wrote a piece about how the New York Times made up a fantasy explanation for the fact that we now have absurdly unprecedented high rates of student absences. They just said, oh, well, it's the culture has changed. The same sort of lie that is happening in the UK with the quote unquote sick no culture. People just want to pretend to be sick. It's not because we have this brand new circulating virus that everyone's getting multiple times a year. It couldn't be that. They just kind of don't want to come to school anymore. No, these poor motherfucking kids are sicker. They are sicker and their immune system is not getting stronger. It is getting weaker because we are not protecting them from viruses, which is what we should be doing.
Absolutely. Well, Julia, thank you so much for joining me today. Fascinating conversation. We're going to have to do this again because we didn't even get into like the half of it. And I think it's important. It's very, very important to me personally, to all my listeners. I hope you're taking this all to heart and doing what you can. Again, it's not all lockdown or nothing. You know, there are things you can do. There's ways to protect yourself. And the Gauntlet is a great place to find out about those things and read up. So, Julia, tell us one more time where everybody can find you.
Yes. So www.thegauntlet.news is my Substack. And tons of different articles on there looking at all the different things that are happening since COVID has been normalized. I also talk a lot about the political process of normalization and the media complicity in that.
All right, folks. That was Struggle Session. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Peace.